What kind of kingdom celebrates the union of a princess and her own brother beneath the vaulted ceilings of its grandest hall? The torches burn bright, casting their glow on walls heavy with centuries of rule. Yet all eyes are fixed on a bride who walks not toward a foreign prince, but toward the man who shares her blood. The air smells of incense and wine, but also of something unspoken, a quiet dread that seeps into every whispered prayer. The choir sings as though this is holy. The court smiles as though this is destiny. And somewhere, behind the gold and silk, the truth tightens its grip. Her crown gleams, but it weighs like a shackle. Every step toward the altar is measured, rehearsed, as if the very ground would crumble should she turn away. They call it tradition, a sacred bond to preserve divine blood. Yet the girl beneath the veil knows it as something else entirely. The walls of the palace rise around her, not as a fortress of protection, but as a prison forged from marble and fear. A prison where the bars are not of iron, but of lineage, where blood itself becomes the chain that binds her. And as the vows are spoken, it becomes impossible to tell whether this is love or something older, colder, and far more dangerous. Is this truly the will of the gods, or the will of men who claim to speak for them here? The line between devotion and domination blurs until it vanishes entirely. This is not just a wedding. It is an initiation into a cult of blood, where desire is irrelevant, consent is meaningless, and the only law is purity of lineage. The question that haunts this day will haunt the centuries to come. Is this love, or a religious rite dressed in royal robes? If you believe that behind every crown lies a curse, subscribe to our channel, where history bleeds through silence. In the palaces of ancient Egypt, the Ptolemies ruled not only as monarchs, but as living gods. Their crowns carried the weight of both pharaoh and conqueror, and their blood was said to descend from the divine. To marry beyond that sacred circle was unthinkable. Brother wed sister beneath the shadow of towering columns, not because love called them, but because the gods, as their priests claimed, demanded it. The union was a seal on the throne, a vow that no drop of royal blood would ever spill into common veins. This idea did not die with the temples along the Nile. In Europe, centuries later, the grand halls of the Habsburgs and the Bourbons echoed with the same quiet logic. The language had changed. It was spoken now in the tone of politics and strategy, but the truth was the same. Marrying a cousin or a niece kept kingdoms whole, estates untouched, crowns safe from the hands of rivals. On maps, these unions preserved borders. In the private chambers of palaces, they preserved something less visible but far more jealously guarded: the belief that royal blood was set apart, a rare metal that must never be alloyed. Religion gave this belief its sanctity. Kings were chosen by God, and their families, so it was taught, were vessels of that choice. To keep the bloodline pure was to keep the divine favor unbroken. Clergy blessed these marriages as acts of piety, and the people were told they were witnessing the will of heaven. Over time, this was no longer just a tradition. It became a creed, an enclosed faith in which only those born to the circle could partake. It had its ceremonies, its laws, its sacrifices. The palace was both temple and prison. The crown, both blessing and chain. To be born within was to inherit not only titles and jewels, but the unspoken command: marry only those whose blood mirrors your own. It was a cult of power hidden in plain sight, wrapped in gold and silk, yet rooted in fear of losing what the crown could not exist without. And for the princesses born into it, the cost was always personal, always irreversible. The temple was cool and dim, its columns rising like a stone forest. Cleopatra II walked as if the ground had been tempered to accommodate her steps. Priests circle slowly. Incense curls upward in pale ribbons. The court is arranged by rank, eyes fixed on the altar where her brother waits. Gold crowns answer each other across the aisle. The choir does not swell into romance, but settles into a chant older than the vows. In this moment, she is both bride and offering. The crowd sees divine will. She feels the weight of a story written long before she could speak. Foreign envoys watch closely. A high priest lifts his hands to bless the union that will keep Egypt whole. No one asks her what she believes. Her silence is the final protocol. When the crown touches her hair again, the record will call it destiny. But it is also captivity disguised as duty. Centuries later, in the marble corridors of Vienna, Maria Anna of Spain stands before a mirror while ladies fasten a gown heavy with pearls. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and expectation. She is to marry Ferdinand III, her first cousin, binding Madrid and Vienna in an unbreakable knot. The chapel corridor feels longer than it did yesterday. Inside, stained glass scatters the light, and the archbishop speaks of providence. The faces in the pews, carved with the famous Habsburg jaw, tilt in approval. She answers the vows on cue, her voice steady, her heart quieted by years of preparation. The music above her sounds like hinges closing on a door. The chronicles will remember velvet, pearls, and solemn organ chords. They will write that Europe was safer that day. They will not write the private truth, that a young woman felt history's hand over her mouth. Far to the west, in 1765, candles burn along the nave of a Spanish cathedral. Maria Luisa of Parma places her hand into that of the Prince of Asturias, the future Charles IV. Their kinship is well known, called prudent by the court. A Jesuit sermon describes their bloodline as a chain of light, stretching back to kings anointed by God. Music drifts from hidden galleries. Orange blossoms scent the air. She keeps her gaze fixed just below his chin, as the palace matrons have taught her. She smiles when required, bows when expected. Every gesture has been rehearsed. Across centuries and borders, the audience consumes the spectacle and calls it sacred order. They see mothers of kings, anchors of nations, vessels of continuity. They do not see the cost choices never taken, letters never sent, glances toward doors that will not open. They do not see the discipline it takes to stand perfectly still when the life inside you strains against the role you have been given. Sometimes, a lady-in-waiting notices. She sees the knuckles whitening around a bouquet, the stillness that is not peace but restraint. She notices, then hides it beneath the same protocol that sustains her own position. The priest blesses, the envoy smiles, the musician plays, and the bride keeps walking. The chronicles will say alliances were secured, dynasties preserved, God's will fulfilled. The truth beneath is sharper. The princess did not choose. She was chosen. Her wedding day was not the opening of a new life, but her final step into the inner circle where blood is the law. And love only matters if it happens to fall within the permitted circle. Behind those closed doors begins the regimen that will shape her days, decide her movements, and guard the lineage above all else. And that is where we turn next, Behind the guarded doors of the royal apartments, life followed a rhythm as strict as the tolling of the chapel bell. In the courts of the Habsburgs, every movement of a princess was regulated by the etiquette code, a body of rules so detailed that even the angle of her curtsy to visiting ambassadors was prescribed. The day began at dawn when chambermaids, appointed by the Queen Mother, entered with warm water for washing. Curtains were drawn in a precise order. First the inner silk, then the heavy brocade, to admit the morning light exactly as the mistress of the robes decreed. Dressing was a public act. Ladies of the bedchamber presented garments chosen by senior members of the family, each color and jewel selected to convey the dignity of her house. In Bourbon Spain, a royal bride might be expected to wear the same style of gown on certain feast days for decades, maintaining visual continuity with her predecessors. The fabrics came from workshops known to the crown, never from unapproved merchants, to prevent the smallest breach in security or tradition. Meals were equally formal. In Vienna, the grand couvert required the princess to dine in a stateroom, seated beneath portraits of ancestors, while members of the court stood to observe. Conversation was ceremonial, often confined to compliments or matters of protocol. Any private word was at risk of being repeated, and so few were spoken. Letters were a privilege, not a right. In Spain, they were dictated to a scribe, copied for the archives, and sealed only after inspection by a royal secretary. Contact with the outside world was rare. Walks in palace gardens took place under escort, with guards posted along the paths. Visits to the chapel or the theater were orchestrated so that no unexpected encounter could occur. A princess was never left unattended in the presence of a man not of her family, not even for the space of a heartbeat. In the Ptolemaic palaces of Alexandria, sources describe women of the royal house living in private quarters accessible only to a select group of servants, priests, and close relatives. The corridors were patrolled, and entry was recorded on wax tablets by scribes. The intent was clear: to preserve the lineage from any shadow of scandal. Over time, such confinement altered more than daily routine. It reshaped how a princess saw herself, surrounded by courtiers whose loyalty was to the dynasty. She learned that her smiles and silences were equally tools of statecraft. Even her gestures were part of the realm's diplomacy. A tilt of the head could be read as approval or refusal. A misplaced glance might become court gossip by nightfall. There were moments when the weight of tradition pressed more heavily. The annual celebrations of a royal marriage were both reminder and reinforcement, attended by the same faces, repeated in the same halls, as if the years themselves were bound in ceremony. When she looked into the mirrors of her apartments, she saw not only herself, but the reflection of countless women before her, each held in place by the same unbroken chain of duty. To those outside the palace gates, this life appeared enviable, filled with silks, jewels, and deference. To the women within, it was a life where choice had been replaced by protocol, and where the most ordinary freedoms could not be imagined. Yet the purpose of such restrictions was always the same: to ensure that the bloodline remained untouched by anything that might weaken its claim. In guarding it so fiercely, the court also set in motion consequences it could not foresee. The very purity they sought to preserve would one day begin to erode the strength it was meant to protect. And that is where our story now turns. Illness often entered the royal nursery as quietly as a shadow. In the grand chambers where silver rattles and embroidered cradles waited, the first cries of an infant could already carry the echo of fragility. Physicians, sworn to the service of the crown, knew the risks of the unions they were blessing. when marriage joined not just two people but two strands of the same blood. The child that came after often bore the cost. In the Ptolemaic court of Egypt, records speak of royal children who did not survive their first seasons, their deaths explained as the will of the gods. The truth, whispered among healers, was that some were born too frail, with fevers that no offering could cure. In Bourbon, Spain, christenings could be followed within months by solemn funeral masses. Infants wrapped in white silk lay beneath vaults painted with angels, their names inscribed in family ledgers beside a birth date and a death date separated by only weeks. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Habsburg dynasty. Centuries of intermarriage had concentrated their lineage until it turned inward upon itself. The most striking emblem of this was the Habsburg jaw, a pronounced protrusion of the lower lip and jawbone seen in portrait after portrait. Behind the oil paint, the condition carried real difficulties, impaired chewing, speech problems, and chronic pain. In Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, the signs were severe. Contemporary accounts describe his fragile frame, his difficulty speaking, his inability to produce an heir. His medical records, studied centuries later, point to a level of genetic inbreeding so high it mirrored the offspring of direct siblings. These were not isolated misfortunes. They were patterns, repeated across generations. Children were stillborn. Others grew but could not thrive, succumbing to infections that healthier bodies might have resisted. Some suffered from neurological conditions that were never named in their time, but are now recognized as the result of genetic narrowing. The corridors of royal palaces, so careful to guard purity, also became places where silence fell heavily over the smallest coffins. The consequences reached beyond the nursery. A dynasty without healthy heirs faced crises that no army could resolve. In Spain, the death of Charles II, without an heir, set off the War of the Spanish Succession, drawing in nearly every power in Europe. In Egypt, succession disputes erupted when a royal line weakened, and competing branches claimed the throne. The very marriages meant to secure power instead sowed instability, as alliances collapsed without the anchor of a strong successor. In private, queens and princesses bore the unspoken weight of these losses. A mother might sit for a portrait holding a surviving child, while out of frame, others had been buried in cloisters or beneath chapel floors. Each new pregnancy carried both hope and dread. Courtiers offered congratulations in public, but in private, they wondered whether the child would live long enough to walk the palace halls. The court physicians, bound by loyalty, avoided open criticism of the practice. They prescribed tonics, ordered blessings, and reported their failures as fate. Yet in their private notes, some hinted at the truth that the palace's obsession with bloodlines was eroding the very strength it sought to protect. By the time these dynasties began to see the pattern, it was often too late. The damage could not be undone in a single generation. The chain of lineage, so carefully guarded, had weakened link by link until it could no longer bear the weight of the crown. And when that chain broke, the fall was swift. From the outside, these collapses looked like political shifts, wars won and lost, treaties signed and broken. But inside the walls, among the women who bore the children and the men who buried them, the truth was simpler and harder. The purity they had been told to protect had become a poison, and from that poison, even the mightiest throne could not recover. The end of the blood cult did not come with a dramatic decree. It came like the slow loosening of a centuries-old grip. In Paris, the guillotine cut more than flesh. It severed the belief that monarchs ruled by divine right. Crowds in the streets chanted of liberty, equality, fraternity, and the idea that royal blood was different from any other began to bleed away. Across Europe, palaces trembled under the weight of revolution. In the decades that followed, diplomacy shifted. No longer were alliances built solely on marriages between close kin. Trade agreements, military coalitions, and constitutional reforms began to matter more than the purity of a family tree. In Vienna, the Habsburg court, once a fortress of intermarriage, opened its doors to foreign matches that would have been unthinkable a century before. In Madrid, the Bourbon dynasty began to pair its heirs with partners from distant royal lines, wary of the fragility that had haunted their nurseries for generations. Cultural change moved just as quickly. The Enlightenment whispered into gilded chambers, carrying talk of science, reason, and individual worth. Philosophers questioned the chains of tradition. Physicians began to speak cautiously of heredity, hinting that the illnesses plaguing royal children might be more than misfortune. What had been hidden behind palace walls was now discussed in salons and printed in pamphlets. For some princesses, the shift came in time. No longer bound to uncles or cousins, they crossed borders to marry distant princes, or even nobles of lesser rank, carrying with them a sense of choice their mothers had never known. Their weddings were still adorned with silk and ceremony, but the air was lighter, the vows not quite as heavy with inevitability. The last of the close-blooded unions faded quietly. The public had seen too many heirs falter, too many funerals draped in velvet before a child had learned to speak. Science had given the pattern a name, and politics had made it unnecessary. Modern historians do not romanticize what was lost. They read the chronicles and see a system that trapped women, weakened dynasties, and mistook isolation for strength. The portraits of those final generations, still hanging in royal galleries, show the beauty of power and the cost carved into its faces. The blood cult ended not because kings and queens chose mercy, but because history forced their hands. In the end, the very obsession that had promised eternal rule had sown its own destruction. And though the gates opened, the echo of those closed rooms still lingers in the corridors of Europe's oldest palaces. The echo of those unions still lingers, not in the language of decrees or the dust of old archives, but in the faces that look out from centuries-old portraits. Stand before them long enough, and you will see it, the careful stillness in their eyes, the beauty framed in gold leaf, and beneath it all, the quiet surrender of someone who learned early that her life was not hers to live. The marble floors they walked still hold the memory of footsteps that never strayed from their prescribed path. Even now, these stories cling to the walls of the palaces they once called home. Tourists marvel at the chandeliers, the painted ceilings, the jeweled crowns in glass cases. Few notice the absence of doors in those ceremonial halls, the kind that lead to freedom. These were worlds where the air itself was regulated, where the meaning of love was rewritten until it fit inside the shape of a family tree. Absolute power has always had the same instinct to create its own laws, to carve out a realm where morality bends to serve its survival. In the courts of the blood cult, that survival was measured in lineage, and lineage was guarded with a cruelty dressed as duty. Those who lived under it were told it was sacred, that it was the will of heaven. But history has stripped away the gold and left us with the truth that sacredness, when it is wielded without mercy, becomes nothing more than a crown placed on the head of suffering. The legacy is not just political, it is human. It reminds us how quietly oppression can be built, how easily it can be disguised as tradition, how long it can endure when wrapped in beauty. And it asks us a question that is not about the past, but about now when power calls something necessary. How far will we let it go before we see what it has taken from us? The women who lived this life cannot speak to us, but the silence in their portraits can. It warns that beauty without freedom is a mask, and power without limits is a prison no less real for being made of gold. If this truth unsettles you, let it. That unease is the thread that will lead you deeper into the stories history tried to hide. There are more rooms to open, more rituals to uncover, more names the past would rather you forget. Follow us into them. Subscribe and walk with us into the shadows where power was at its most radiant and its most merciless.